Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the final Strauss Center International Security Speaker Series event of the spring semester. Stay tuned for future. Usually at this time I flog the next Strauss Center event. It will be in the fall. Stay tuned. The Robert Strauss Center, so it's www.robertstrausscenter.org is a good place to learn about the series, and there will be events continuing on international security broadly defined in the fall. I'm Eugene Goltz. I'm a professor at the LBJ School, and I've been organizing the series, and I'm very pleased that you all have found your way to this venue. Often we have these events in the library, and I was a little nervous that the new place would faze people, but it apparently didn't, so welcome. I would also like to thank the UT's Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies for co-sponsoring with us today's event. We do international security broadly defined topics all over the map, and we are very eager to coordinate with other units on campus when there's a substantive overlap. And today I think we have wonderful substantive overlap, and so I'd like to thank them for that and get started on our introduction for today. So the reason there's such a great overlap is that today's topic is on Eurasian energy security dilemmas, and it's really, it says Russia's energy statecraft is the subtitle, and to me, this is the exact intersection of Russia as an important player in international politics, and this is kind of part of the core area on which they might exercise power. And today's speaker, Adam Stulberg, has a lot to tell us or to explain to us how we should think about Russia's potential power or their effects in international politics of exercising energy statecraft. I should say, as I introduced Adam, he's an expert on lots of these energy issues and on Russia, but he also has in another part of his life a big interest in another area where Russia has an influence on international politics, which is nuclear strategy and nuclear issues. And our previous talk in this series was by Scott Sagan on nuclear energy and nuclear proliferation in the future, and he's not going to talk about it today, but if you have leftover questions for Scott, this is an area that Adam knows about too, and so I don't know where that will lead us, but that's the other thing that he works on, or another area. And I'll say there's a third area that he works on a lot, which is innovation, military innovation, this new kind of conceptual area of network-centric warfare, and that's really where we first ran across each other, was because we have overlapping interests in military innovation, particularly U.S. military innovation. So Adam's an expert on a lot of things, but for today, what he is an expert on Eurasian energy security. He's a professor at Georgia Tech and in their International Affairs School, and the co-director of, he has it up there as CISTEP, because you all must know what that means. Of course, everyone knows. It's the Center for International Security, Technology, and Policy, which obviously blends many of the same interests that we have here and we have in this speaker series. And so he seems like a perfect speaker for us, and I really look forward to hearing his remarks. So, Adam.
Well, thank you. I noticed on my way over here that Karl Rove is speaking on campus, and I'm quite pleased to see that Russia is still alive and is able to command an audience in the face of such another speaker on campus. Okay. So you're all excused if you leave a little early, I guess. I've been asked to talk a little bit today about Russia's energy diplomacy, and specifically, does energy actually provide Russia a tool of coercion or statecraft? But it's also related to a much bigger set of issues as to whether or not energy can be used as a tool of statecraft for other states as well. But with the specific focus on Russia, it's really not a new question. right? For those of you who are historians, know about the Great Game and how energy became a focal point of grand strategic competition at the end of the 19th century. Those of you who are former Soviet scholars know that energy really was very much a part of the Soviet fabric of institutional bonds. And also those of you who looked at the Soviet Union from afar, from a Western perspective, know that in the late 70s and 80s, we were confronted with the same types of issues. Then obviously when the Soviet Union collapsed, these issues came to the fore. And so why are we talking about these issues yet again? Well, really in the last couple of years, a number of events, including tightening energy markets combined with some of the rhetoric coming out of the current and previous governments in Russia, together with actions on the ground, so to speak, the war between Russia and Georgia, and the successive gas wars with Ukraine have really reignited the debate as to whether or not energy is an important element of Russia's coercive diplomacy. And as former National Security Advisor, then Secretary of State Rice said, energy really brings to the fore a basic question about Russia. Is it a 19th century power, focused on exploiting its largesse for strategic ends, or is it willing to participate like a 21st century power in globalized, interdependent markets where leverage is much more diffused? And so this has prompted a policy debate as well as a scholarly debate. And as I mentioned, on the one hand, you sort of have the realpolitik or realist arguments that focus on resource nationalism. On the other hand, you sort of have these sort of globalizers and interdependence, and interdependency leading to cooperation arguments, pointing to the market mechanisms within these energy markets as shock absorbers and defanging Russia's imperial ambitions, and then pointing to most recently some of the statements by Putin, who has invited investment in the Russian energy sector in return for downstream investment for Russian companies in Europe. And even more recently, President Medvedev's proposal for establishing a new international legal framework for energy transit and transfers that put a premium on responsibilities for both suppliers and customers. So there's this big policy scholarly debate that is coming to the head over different pipeline issues and Europe's future. Well, to cut to the chase, my own analysis suggests that this dichotomy between sort of realpolitik and globalization it presents a false dichotomy. Because as we all know, and those are sort of scholars of international relations know, that states can practice diplomacy and coercion and influence in interdependent relations. So they're not sort of either interdependence or some sort of resource nationalism argument. Also, this dichotomy distorts Russia's energy prowess. It both overstates and understates Russia's leverage, and because it varies according to different sectors. It also misses a lot of the interesting dynamics of energy statecraft. In a previous set of research efforts, I looked at how states actually practice energy leverage, and much of it is more indirect, nuanced. It doesn't involve threats or actually turning off the spigot. As we'll mention, those might be actually symptoms of a failure of statecraft rather than a successful statecraft. So there's a lot more that takes place than looking at just these sort of gas wars or these very overt examples. It also fails to take into account the distinction between economic competitiveness in the energy sectors and strategic competitiveness, and the difficulty sometimes of distinguishing between the two, and the potential inadvertent escalation elements of practicing competitive economic relations that may lead to blowback on the strategic front. So there's a lot more going on than this simple dichotomy suggests. And as a result, in this current project, which is a sort of work in progress, and therefore I'm really interested in your input, it tries to take a step back in thinking about energy and coercion, and asking, what does it actually mean? What are the conditions under which states can use energy as a tool of statecraft towards what ends? How do we know it when we see it? How do we measure it? How do we distinguish between commercial competitiveness and strategic competitiveness? How do we explain cases of inadvertent escalation? And also, I look specifically in trying to address these issues at Russia, because Russia presents an interesting social science experiment, if you will, because you have variation. Variation on the tools that it tries to use, and variation in the outcome. It is also highly policy relevant, as I mentioned earlier. So in the time allotted, I'd like to cover a number of things. And to really get to understanding Russia's strategic energy leverage, or at least how I see it, I want to begin by embarking on sort of a mind-sweeping exercise and sort of talking about what I think are at least 4 prominent myths about Russia's energy leverage. And then talk a little bit about how I see the relationship between energy and international security, some of the basics of the landscape. And then talk about how those basics map onto Russia's energy predicament in both the oil and the gas sectors, and then how that can explain the case where Russia has failed miserably, according to, in my analysis, in practicing oil diplomacy, but has been relatively successful in practicing gas diplomacy. How can we explain this outcome? And then talk about some of the implications. What is the trajectory that I see Russia on in both those sectors, and what are some of the implications for competition as well as cooperation? So, as I mentioned, sort of looking at Russia and energy, one can't help but being intoxicated with the notion of energy coercion. As I mentioned, we have tight energy markets that's made countries, especially the large Western customer countries, extremely sensitive. You also have the rhetoric coming out of Moscow talking about Russia's privileged sphere of influence in Eurasia, where it has rightful competitive advantages, specifically in the energy sector, where they'll use energy as a tool of statecraft. You know, all of these statements out there, coupled with, in the academy, discussions about increasingly the role of resource nationalism. But before we get too carried away with this common discourse, as I mentioned, there are some basics that I think we need to keep in mind when assessing Russia's energy statecraft. First, has to do with the myth about Russia being an energy superpower, something that we always hear about. And by the numbers, I think one could call Russia maybe a gas superpower, but clearly not an oil superpower. In fact, Russia, for the most part, is an oil price taker. It does not have swing production capacity, and it doesn't control international prices. And one of the problems with trying to use this moniker of Russia being an energy superpower is it doesn't really pay heed to a lot of the technical aspects about different energy markets. And the fact that oil is an integrated market where you deliver oil in one part of the world, prices reverberate in another part of the world, as opposed to, up to now, for the most part, gas markets have been very regional, which have played to Russia's advantage. So there's variation there that's really missed when you just sort of focus on stuff by the numbers and looking at the fact that Russia has 35% of the proven reserves and 50% of the export markets. Really miss those nuances. It also misses the fact that there are a number of structural impediments that Russia faces in realizing even this potential in the gas sector, where there are investment shortfalls. Production, in fact, not only has been stagnating for the previous several years, but has actually begun to decline. And actually, in 2009, the United States actually produced more gas than Russia did. Russia saw a 12% decline. Gazprom, the big state gas company, saw a 16% decline in its production, largely due to the fact that they've been, in both the oil and gas sectors, really living off the benefits of the investments of the Soviet Union, and they've not been replenishing their upstream investments. They keep stretching out the time horizons. So there have, we could talk more about some of those production problems, investment problems. And similarly, there are a number of transport bottlenecks. Their pipelines are increasingly aged. There are a number of bottlenecks. Even when the prices were quite high several years ago, Russia suffered from oil that was shut in. They couldn't actually get it out to markets due to the physical infrastructure and the regulatory mechanisms. So there are structural problems on the pipeline side, on the investment side, on the production side, and on the regulatory side. In addition, there's another myth that somehow Europe, and especially in the wake of the 2009 Russian-Ukrainian gas war, is on its knees with respect to Russian gas, and that Russia's supply of gas, over 60% of Russia's, or I should say about 40% in the oil sector and a little less, 30% in the gas sector for Europe's gas consumption, mistakes the fact that this is really a two-way street. Because if you just once again look at the numbers, you see that Russia depends on Europe for about 65 to 70% of its exported gas. Europe, as a percentage of overall consumption of Russian gas, in terms of its overall consumption, is between 3 and 5% of overall electricity consumption. So Europe is actually not, as a whole, is not as dependent on Russia. In fact, it's less dependent today than it was in a decade ago. Now, of course, there are some countries that are in a more precarious situation, but as a whole, Europe is less. There are a number of shock absorbers, too, in that codependent relationship, where Russia really doesn't have an alternative market to substitute for those markets in Europe. There's no, because of the subsidized gas prices and the underdeveloped nature of the domestic gas market, they can't quickly ship gas there as an alternative to Europe. And obviously the infrastructure is not built up for shifting gas to Asia. So there are a number of problems there. There are a number of gas storage facilities in Europe and reserves in Europe that can cushion some of the blows. And it's not to suggest that Europe wouldn't feel pain, which we did see in 2009. It's just that this is a codependent relationship, and that both parties would be significantly negatively affected by going to the mat on gas. There's another myth out there, and it's sort of similar to what we used to talk about in the United States, which was what was good for GM was good for the United States. In Russia, there's a common refrain that's what's good for Gazprom is good for the state. And this is a very complicated set of relations, and I don't want to get into all the details, but maybe we can in the Q&A. But a couple things to keep in mind that I think were vivid in the most recent gas strategies, both by the state and by Gazprom, that really reflect the divergence of interest. For Gazprom, they're primarily concerned about profits. For the state, they're more concerned about revenue generation. The state has been, as articulated in their new energy strategy towards 2030, has put a premium on investments in new production, efficiency, unconventional gas, a gradual increase in domestic prices, called for more clear corporate governance of the company. The company has said it's put its primary focus less on upstream investment, more on downstream investment in marketing. It wants a quick shift in domestic gas prices, and not so keen on the corporate governance issues that the state is articulating. So even in these two transparent documents, you see very different sets of interests. Now, of course, the politics of the relationship between the state and Gazprom has been very complicated, and really throughout the 90s, the state had a large difficulty trying to get a hold of the company, and it subsequently now has slightly over 50% stake. But even with that, politics reigns. I mean, the current Russian leadership, especially the president, is not seen as a gas person, not really trusted by the gas sector. So there are divergent interests here. It's not to suggest that they can't be convergent, okay? And in areas they do converge. But they're not one and the same, and there are tensions that exist. And so the challenge for the state is to manipulate some of its authorities, as we'll talk about, to get Gazprom on the same page at times in terms of a statecraft set of issues. Another problem, another myth, is that Russia has been uniformly successful in practicing energy coercion. And this is something that is sort of really brought to the fore in the discussion of the 2009 Russian-Ukrainian gas war. And it mistakes, or it misses some of the real obvious issues that on oil it's been troubled at best. And I would argue that it's failed miserably. But the whole notion of winning and losing and success in energy statecraft is a very confusing issue. If you just look by the numbers, and by the way, for those graduate students out there, this is a great field of study because there's a lot of data in energy markets with prices, volumes, different set of policies that can be looked at. But we don't see a lot of quantitative or even real systematic qualitative analysis of this. But there are a few quantitative studies, and there have been a little over 60 episodes where gas and oil have either been threatened or actually been cut off between Russia and a Eurasian customer since the Soviet collapse. About 50% of those episodes, however, have been the result of economic or technical problems. 10% of those cases don't involve Russia at all. All right, so just because there may have been a stoppage or a threat doesn't necessarily indicate success or that Russia was actually complicit in some of these issues. And as we'll talk about, some instances, and I would argue the 2009 gas war is a case where things got out of control and there was some inadvertent escalation. But there's a bigger set of problems in trying to understand energy coercion because we're not clear what the aims are of any of these efforts. Are they to get equity stakes? Are they to affect prices or volumes in deals? Are they to change governments, change foreign policy orientations? There are a whole host of potential outcomes that are not really systematically looked at there in this case. Also, when we're talking about issues of coercion, which is the subject of the talk today and of my own research, when states actually have to use brute force by, let's say, turning off the spigot, is that a sign of successful coercion or failed coercion, right? Coercion is issuing a threat and holding something in reserve, okay? If you have to go to the mat, then it seems like maybe that was a failure. So how we assess success or failure is a challenge in this particular area. It's also a problem, as I mentioned, because we have had variation in Russia's behavior. As I mentioned, variation in the outcomes in the oil versus the gas sector. We've had variation despite private and state ownership. We've had about the same number of incidents practiced under the Yeltsin administration as under the Putin-Medvedev administration. So the claims that sort of Putin is using increasingly energy as an oil or gas weapon is not really borne out by the fact that they used it a lot, or they may have attempted to use it a lot previously. So how much change is really there is problematic. So the landscape is quite muddled, and this is something that I know that those of you who are studying energy and international security here at the LBJ school note that there's also a very difficult challenge in trying to see correlations, either between international events and prices, or prices then shaping international events. If you just look at sort of the the Russian-Georgian war, you see, the argument is that this was either motivated by energy or the war itself fundamentally changed the energy markets. And you see that prices really didn't track very well with the crisis, and to the extent that there was a blip, it had more to do with a financial crisis or anxiety about a pending financial crisis in the United States, the situation in Mexico, weather conditions, than it did with respect to what Russia was doing to Georgia. Also, the pipelines there, the BTC, to the extent to which there was any cratering going on, was not really fundamentally influencing the international markets at about 1%. It also went offline, not due to Russia's act, but more to what was going on in Turkey during the period. And the challenges that Georgia faced as a transit state really were pregnant before that crisis. So once again, drawing correlations between some of these international events and even prices or energy markets is a challenge. So, Mr. Big Shot, how do we make sense out of all this stuff? Well, I don't want to get into a long discourse on energy and international security, but there's some basics that I think that are important to keep in mind when thinking about how states use energy as a tool of statecraft. One is that energy markets are increasingly interdependent. And that states have, as we talk about in the literature, have incurred, right, the sort of energy trap, even the great powers, where their needs for energy, and especially hydrocarbons, have outstripped their indigenous capacity to provide for them. And even those that can provide for a large share of their own domestic consumption bump up against others in terms of how other states' behavior affects international prices, the volumes, etc. So we see an increasingly interdependent set of energy markets where states bump up against each other and are affected by the domestic decisions in each other's countries. So while this is a self-help environment, the states are affected by each other's own domestic behavior. Another thing to keep in mind in the discussion about resource nationalism, sometimes it gets lost, is that there are many faces of resource nationalism. States have choices in how they respond to their energy predicaments. They can decide to protect markets. They can decide to invest abroad. They can use the states as the main driver as opposed to the private sector. There are a whole host. They can put a focus on efficiency and reducing demand, okay, as well as increasing supply. They can increase supply working together with another state or investing together with other foreign companies rather than seeking to control and dominate. So there are a whole host of choices that states make, even as they pursue sort of national security in the energy realm. A third important issue, and for those of you who are scholars or budding scholars, this is a potentially an important thing to keep in mind. Energy statecraft and energy interaction is not just driven by uncertainties. Certainly there is uncertainty in the energy field. There's uncertainty about the geology, about how much energy is in the ground, where and when are we going to see peak oil. Okay, we see price volatility, volume volatility. So there's certainly uncertainty. But this is a sector where risk is also important. So all of our models of state action that are predicated on expected utility calculations, where states seek to optimize, right, between cost, benefits, and probabilities, right, leave out that when we're talking about energy, right, companies, and we are in Texas, know that they swing for the fences, right? It's about their high startup costs, so you're going for a real big payoff at the end. So it's about the distance between, you're maximizing the distance between the real high payoff, right, and the bad outcome, right? And if there's a real opportunity for a huge gain, right, that can be an attractive situation. So there are gamblers out there. And the energy markets and the energy sector really entices a lot of gamblers, both on the private side and on the state side. So that's not to say that all states are gamblers. There can be in different predicaments, but risk matters a lot in this calculus. And as I mentioned, and this is a subject of something that I wrote a lot about, is that statecraft in the energy sector has a lot more to do than threatening to turn off the spigot. Statecraft is actually practiced indirectly for the most part. You know, when we think about sort of relative power, A is trying to get B by threatening to bludgeon B into some sort of action. In an interdependent interaction, right, B has several options that it can turn to. There are alternative suppliers or alternative markets that may defang A. But in a lot of cases, when it comes to energy, when you're trying to get B to do something, sometimes you manipulate what its options are going to be. So you'll beat B to a market, or in C and D to foreclose opportunities. So you can affect their opportunity costs and their risk calculation. And this has really been a focal point of a lot of my own research, is looking at how states try to get target states, be they target suppliers or target customers, to bend to their will in the energy sector by either making compliance or working with them a very attractive option, or non-compliance a very unattractive option. Okay, and manipulating the risk and the opportunity costs as much as the direct costs of engagement. But we can talk about that later. Another important thing to keep in mind, and this is a subject of where a lot of my research is beginning to focus, is on the fact that states in the energy sector face increasingly what those of us in the security sector have identified a long time ago, which is called the security dilemma. And it's where actions taken for purely benign reasons, such as wanting to diversify your supply base or build gas storage facilities to protect you from an event where your supply is immediately cut off, may be seen as a threat to an existing supplier, for example. So as I mentioned, in these cases, right, as one state may seek to diversify its supply, it may challenge the existing set of relations that a current supplier has. Or a supplier may want to vertically integrate in an industry that may make a lot of economic sense, right, through transaction costs, savings on transaction costs, but may at the same time be seen as an imperial gesture by another state. So it's very hard for states, even in the best of circumstances, to be able to distinguish commercial, benign efforts, strategically benign efforts, from those that may have more neo-imperial intentions. And so, just as others have tried to look at this context of the security dilemma in the strategic domain, in the military sphere that focus on geography and technology and a whole host of other variables, I've begun to try to explore what the security dilemma looks like in the energy sphere. And for me, rather than sort of military technology and geography being the prominent factors, I see variables such as market power and how clearly delineated a regulatory system is. So just as Bob Jervis and others have taught me to see things in a very limited way, I see it's only possible to have 4 worlds out there. And so the 4 worlds that I see are such where states either have market power, okay, that affects their ability to create opportunities or exploit vulnerabilities, and the other variable is how clearly regulated and how clearly delineated, I should say, authorities are in the regulatory sector of a particular energy domain. So how clearly defined the rights are to levy taxes, to set prices, to give transit access to both domestic and export pipelines. And the argument on the latter is that clearly delineated regulatory systems create clear sets of interest. It can strengthen the capacity. It can also it can increase the efficacy of statecraft because states don't necessarily need to own or control a whole domestic sector. They can have a few rights, like the ability to change domestic prices that can reverberate throughout the system to affect the commercial decisions of other actors. Alternatively, in very opaque, diffused regulatory systems, signals can't be sent very well. There's a lot of corruption, a lot of multiple claimants have overlapping authorities. It's very difficult to send clear signals. But one of the problems of a relatively clearly delineated regulatory system is that because a state doesn't have to dominate that sector to have influence, it's very hard to discern commercial from strategic interests from the outside. And in cases where there's opaque and diffuse, because there's so little capacity, those distinctions aren't so significant. So we have sort of 4 basic worlds here, and I would argue that, well, let's see if I argue here. In this top left quadrant, here a state that has tremendous market power and has clearly delineated rights can present quite a potent challenge and be quite effective at wielding statecraft. There's a challenge, though, because others don't know if it's practicing its policies for commercial ends or strategic ends, so there can be a lot of inadvertent escalation. So this is a very unstable situation for another state to be interacting with this kind of state. Alternatively, the sort of opposite quadrant is where the state would lack any market power and have very opaque regulatory system, so it would have neither the capacity nor the opportunity to exploit energy. And then you have some mixed cases in between. And so what does this all mean for Russia's energy statecraft? Well, one, I see Russia as, in the short term at least, having a significant market power. It has about 30, as I mentioned, 35% of the proven reserves. It has 50% of the global footprint in exports, but it's much higher in specific European markets. It also has competitive advantages at landing gas to established markets since they have the infrastructure up and running, so they're first mover advantages. They're very wide diameter pipes. They can pump a lot of gas through those things. The state, while the state really only recently has become the major stakeholder in the gas company, what has distinguished the gas sector is that the state has always had very clearly delineated rights, and it's had very important rights. One, to set domestic prices and to require quotas for delivery to the domestic consumers. The Gazprom has really controlled the pipeline access and controls all of the exports in the Russian system. The oil sector, though, is very different. It was really one of the first areas to be nationalized, and since then, since 2004, we've seen creeping renationalization. But really on the domestic front, it's been very opaque and diffused. There are multiple actors with redundant authorities, from the federal level down to the gubernatorial level. It's not clear who owns the resources. When there are so many taxes levied that when a state makes a tax, it doesn't reverberate through the business cycles. And Russia, as I mentioned before, is actually does not have global power in the oil markets. It's not a swing producer, and it's a price taker. So for Russia, historically, I would argue that, since the Soviet collapse, they were primarily in the oil and gas sectors in these two opposite quadrants. And this could explain why Russia was quite potent in the gas sector and quite impotent in the oil sector. And as I'll talk about a little bit later, really between 2000 and 2006, Russia's position has sort of changed a little bit in the oil sector, but really not in a decisive way that affects the efficacy of its policies. So what does all of this mean then for Russia's energy statecraft, right? This is the sort of landscape that we're talking about with all the pipelines and politics there. Well, in a nutshell, in dealing with rival suppliers like Turkmenistan, and for a whole host of reasons that we can talk about later, I've seen Turkmenistan to become increasingly a gambler. They have gas is really their main resource, and they need to get it out. And Russia's strategy towards Turkmenistan has been quite indirect but quite effective. And they've been able to do basically three different things. One is they've been able to accentuate the risks of Turkmenistan trying to go around Russia by simply beating Turkmenistan to the punch in the EU markets, really saturating the Turkish hub with the Blue Stream project, as well as the discussion of the follow-on and the South Stream projects. They've been able recently to woo Azerbaijan, the emerging wild card supplier in the South Caucasus, by 2011 quadrupling their purchases from Azerbaijan, so that they're taking important gas away from potential rival pipelines that would be relevant for any kind of Turkmenistan pipeline to Europe. Russia's also increased its investment in Africa and the Middle East and alternative suppliers to Europe to get involved in landing more gas towards Europe to once again displace any future large volumes from Turkmenistan. So they've increased the downside, if you will, of going around Russia. At the same time, they've made doing business with Russia more lucrative for Turkmenistan. Right? They've been able, since 2008, in 2009, they've been paying world prices for Central Asian gas. They've been investing, albeit it's dragged on a little bit with the financial crisis, in a new pipeline, the pre-Caspian pipeline, and modernizing the Central Asian Center pipeline to deliver more Turkmen gas to Russia as opposed to China or Iran. And they've also been able to manipulate their own prices. And this is a very complicated story, but in a nutshell, when prices are high, international prices are high, Russia actually the government uses its authority to lower state prices. So it makes doing business and protecting their established markets for Gazprom more significant for them to get their profits. When prices are lower or moderate on the international stage, especially in Europe, they increase domestic prices such that it covers some of the marginal costs for Gazprom, so that Gazprom satisfies the domestic demand. So they play the domestic price game. They try and beat Turkmenistan to the punch in established and emerging markets, and they make doing business with Russia a more lucrative deal. Kazakhstan, it's slightly different, and I won't go into it as much now, but Kazakhstan's been more opportunistic, less of a gambler, and so what Russia's done is really made the costs outweigh the benefits, or I'm sorry, the benefits outweigh the costs of working with Russia by increasing their reliability primarily and working with Kazakh gas. On oil, however, we see that Russia has really failed miserably, really since the Soviet collapse. And the BTC, the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline is really the classic case. But with Azerbaijan, they've used threats, they've tried to induce, they've just really not been able to wrangle a lot of ventures for their companies, let alone to shift the pipeline politics. And the same thing, for the most part, with Kazakhstan. The most interesting thing that I think people don't pay a lot of attention to is that even in gas, and if we remember, I see Russia sort of in gas in this situation where they're quite powerful, potentially, at least in the short term. But there's a double-edged nature to that, because as I mentioned, it's hard to distinguish commercial from strategic plays in the sector. And what we've seen are a number of inadvertent escalation examples in both the gas and the oil sector. Most recently, with Turkmenistan, if you were reading the newspapers last summer, you know that there was actually an explosion in the big pipeline that delivers Turkmen gas to Russia. And the Russians claimed that this was due to technical difficulties, and the Turkmen wanted nothing of it. And they're sort of riding the hubris of recent studies by the United States that said that there's a lot more potential gas there than we thought, that they were thinking that Azerbaijan may have more gas, and they may make this pipeline to Europe more cost effective. And in response to this breakdown or this explosion, Turkmenistan, so fearful of Russia, was making such a heavy play, shifted into a gambler mode where they were willing to invite European companies, and South Korea and the UAE, into their prize investment projects in Turkmenistan, much to Russia's detriment. Similarly, in the 2009 crisis, and we can talk about this maybe a little bit more detail because it's very different, I would argue, than the 2006 Russian-Ukraine crisis, but you had a situation in 2009 where international prices were going down, European demand was going down, but Russia was now obligated to pay world-class prices in large volumes, purchase large volumes from Central Asia. So the debts that Ukraine was incurring were costing the Russian governments quite significantly. And in fact, Gazprom made statements that they were willing to take anything. Okay, they just needed something. And in fact, also in November, right, this thing came to a head in late December and January 2009. But in November 2008, President Putin and Prime Minister Tymoshenko actually had a deal on the table. It was pretty much the exact same deal that they got after the crisis. But the crisis cost Russia dearly to get that same deal. It cost about $100 million a day for over 2 weeks. Huge bruise on their reputation, and more significantly invited the European Union into Ukraine to force reforms, force investment in the interconnectors and in the gas storage facilities. Very heavy cost to Russian diplomacy. And if you really, those of you who are in the Russia-Eurasia program and were following the news at the time, you can really see Putin lost it. Really in December, it became personal because they were so frustrated. And I think the real great indicator of how inadvertent this crisis was is that once this crisis was settled, it was just several months later. Ukraine was already in arrears, and there have been questions about, and there continue to be questions about Ukraine's ability to pay. And so Russia's response now has been twofold. One, they've allowed Ukraine not to purchase as much gas. And two, rather than turning off the spigot or going to the mat again, they're now lobbying the IMF to allow Ukraine to access special drawing rights to cover their obligations. So they're loath to go to the mat once again, and trying desperately to avoid that, I would argue. Well, they were trying to distinguish a heavy hand play there. I think also in the oil situation, I think it's a much more, like I said, they're much weaker. However, what's very interesting, as I mentioned, in this, as we look to the future, we see that Russia is increasingly, both in the oil and in the gas side, I would argue, coming into this world. In the oil side, it's primarily due to the fact that really since 2004, 2006 period, we saw about a creeping restatization, so about 60% of the industry is owned by the state, which has not changed its market position, but has made it harder for others to discern what is a commercial play from a strategic play. And as a result, when Russia tried to renegotiate the follow-on agreements to the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, it's a pipeline that goes from Kazakhstan through Russia and then out to the Black Sea. You had such an overreaction on the part of the investors that really Russia lost out. Well, it didn't lose out. Its efforts at playing diplomacy were completely rebuffed, and we can talk a little bit about that. But why is Russia moving? If we look out to 2030, why do I see Russia moving into this quadrant in the gas sector, which is really probably the more interesting scenario? Well, I would argue it's a function of the fact that it's a combination of things. For its established markets in Europe, we see the potential for Iraqi gas coming online, liquefied natural gas, and most recently unconventional gas, which has the potential to revolutionize not only the industry, but Russia's leverage. And we can talk a little bit more about that in detail, but the point being is that it's not so much that there's going to be unconventional gas developed all over the world, but in the United States, we're developing this gas, which is displacing liquefied natural gas contracts that we had originally had, and leading towards more deliveries of this liquefied natural gas to Europe that provides an alternative to increasing reliance on Russian gas. So much so that if you read the statements by the Russian energy officials, and even in their 2030 strategy, they've identified unconventional gas as both the critical threat to Russia's strategic position in the sector and an area where they want to really get involved in, especially coal-based methane issues. So this is that's how I see Russia. I mean, I see their trajectory shaping up into a situation where they're potentially going to be losing market power in the gas sector. Yet, because of the difficulty of discerning commercial from strategic plays, they're likely to continue to provoke overreaction. So whereas before they may have provoked overreaction in an area where they at least had more influence, outcomes would be costly, but at least they would maybe prevail, they may find themselves in situations where they're going to have escalation in sectors where, like gas and oil, where they're not going to be in such a strategic market position. So what does all of this mean? Well, I think we need to take markets and institutions seriously and not just sort of have this stale globalization versus realpolitik kind of argument. I think we should also need to pay attention to uncertainty and risk, and not only how the calculation of the investors, but also how states can manipulate risk by increasing the distance between the payoffs of compliance and the extreme costs. Also, I would argue that the issue of reassurance is not the same in these different worlds. As I mentioned, for Russia today in the gas sector, they're in a situation where it's very hard to reassure other states. They have significant market power, and it's very difficult to discern commercial from strategic plays. And in the oil sector, it doesn't really matter if you reassure. They don't have a lot of capacity internally, and I would argue that they're not significant strategic players in the oil sector. But as they get into a world, this sort of upper right world, I think they're going to need to reassure. They're going to need to establish breaks between the commercial sector and the state sector, and this is going to require getting, in the gas sector, more independence involved and relinquishing some of the state authorities. So what does all this mean for competition and cooperation? Well, as I mentioned, in the short term, I think Russia still is a potent player in the gas sector, but I do see it ultimately as a waning asset for them. I think there's some interesting things. You know, if those of you who study Europe, there's always this talk about the need to liberalize prices and get Russia to, the Russian domestic public to pay real prices, right, and make the industry more efficient. But I would argue that this could actually give Russia, in the short term, an alternative market to switch some of that gas that's going to Europe. So in a strategic perspective, I think that the jury's out on that one a little bit. I think that in oil, there may be competitive plays in the commercial sector, but I don't see them being significant flashpoints strategically. I think the real flashpoint potentially is over Turkmenistan's future. To the extent that there are Western backers and state backers of particular pipelines from Central Asia to Europe, I think that will be a bone of contention that could risk getting out of control and escalate. But I would argue that that there may be ways around some of that. I would also suggest that another big problem that I didn't talk about has to do with some of the pipeline politics to some of the transit states. There are some opportunities, though, for cooperation. In the oil sector, there used to be talk of, making concessions to Russian oil companies to demonstrate that we were serious. We took them, as a gesture of confidence building. I'd argue that that really doesn't buy very much because the oil companies can't deliver the state really can't deliver the oil companies in the Russian sector. So I don't see there's much gain from giving concessionary terms to Russia. I would argue that for Russia, if moving forward both on a commercial sense and possibly even on a strategic sense, if they let the market in, there are many geographic advantages that Russia may have in its economic competition with rival suppliers in Central Asia to make it attractive investment for the outside. I think there are a number of intermediary issues that need to be addressed, especially in the transit state. But the real challenge, I think, and the real opportunity for cooperation may be with this unconventional gas, because while Russia may have some especially coal-based methane sources and some shale, they really don't have the investment capability or the technology, the hydrofraction technology that's needed. And they have identified this as an important area that they want to get into, and they're willing to engage the international community on. I think also there are opportunities for cooperation in exploring new emerging markets, as opposed to working with Europe markets. I think there it's a very sensitive issue, and Russia itself is not keen to cooperate too much. I also think that, and lastly, I think that to the extent, and the Obama administration has actually done this, they no longer talk about specific pipelines, Caspian pipelines. They talk about a southern route, and they're getting out of the business of picking which one. And I think that has actually a healthy impact. And even now, their special envoy to the Caspian region has even aired the whole notion of inviting Russia into projects like Nabucco. To not see this as a zero-sum situation. I think there's some advantages to doing that. I think the problems really arise when we talk about specific pipeline arrangements that are seen as potential threats to Russia, as opposed to creating corridors and diversifying altogether. And I think ultimately the EU for it to have its energy security, needs to really get its own house in order, because to the extent that there's in this codependent relationship with Russia, that there's weakness there, it has to do with the fact that the European Union as an institution is relatively weak on energy issues, and there's very little coordination among the nation states. And I think that to the extent that they can do that with respect to developing interconnectors, either sub-regional interconnections with East Central Europe, for example, I think that would be an important opportunity for to putting a cushion in the strategic relationship. But with that, let me turn it over to you all for questions.
This wasn't exactly in your presentation, but obviously related. Can you explain in this context what is the Russian support for Iran? And let me just give you sort of a speculative intro and see if it makes any sense. That one of the reasons that Russia supports Iran, especially on the nuclear issue, is to basically keep it in a position where it's in the international pariah position. And the benefit of this long term would be to basically sideline a potential competitor. For instance, in the Caspian Sea, it's landlocked, and not having Iran would mean not having a southern route to the Persian Gulf for oil, for natural gas, and so forth. So basically the question is, how do you put in the Iran policy in your framework? And thank you.
Well, I mean, there are many directions to go, and I'm going to sort of set the nuclear issue aside, since that's not what I was talking about. But and gas, I think you're exactly right. I think that Russia does see Iran as a competitor, and I think Russia, one of its comparative advantages in the present period is U.S. policy. They've leveraged U.S. policy, which has made Iran unattractive. But they play for keeps in the Caspian. Even with Armenia, they're sort of getting, they want to encourage Armenia to diversify some of its gas relations, get some gas from Iran, but they want to have a stake in that project. They are loath to let Turkmenistan do too much with Iran. I mean, they don't mind the small-scale efforts that are there, but they clearly are using their pole position, if you will, in the with respect to the Caspian supplier states, Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan to some extent, to get them oriented more towards Russia. And at the same time, there have been times where they've explored interests in investing in South Pars and in Iran itself, so that to the extent that Iran eventually comes online, they would benefit from that. But I do think that they see Iran as a competitor, and so they benefit from actually U.S. policy, and they've taken advantage of that in many ways to strengthen their position vis-a-vis the rival suppliers in Central Asia. So I think they don't mind the situation the way it is on that front. I think the nuclear front's a little bit different.
When you were going through your myths, and specifically whether Russia was an energy superpower or not, you suggested that one of the problems here was a lack of reinvestment following the Soviet period. How does that square with the announced reason for the deferral of the development of the Shachtman gas reserve in the Siberian Arctic? When that was announced last year, that was going to be deferred by 2 to 3 years, and they had foreign partners, Total and Statoil, as I recall, in there. They said it was a lack of markets in Russia. Was that true or not? Lack of markets in Europe. Was that true or not?
Well, I think the last couple of years, we have seen delays in the investments because of the recession and the demand, the drop in the demand there. But this has been an issue that people in Russia's energy sector have been calling for a long time. For the last decade, they've been calling for accelerating those investments, not kicking the can. Now, in the last couple of years, there are strong financial reasons why they were not in a position to do that. But Stockman has been, they've not been meeting their targets, and they've really, if you look at it's pretty dramatic what's gone on in the gas sector, given their comparative advantages and the real creaming that they've had from those Soviet investments, to see the stagnation drop to decline. In fact, the leading Russian energy economists now project that by 2030, Russia will have lost 15 to 20% of its market in established markets, and that's with those fields coming online. What's really interesting in the gas sector, I think, is that you talk about unconventional gas. right? But that's really not going to take a big, you're not going to see really big payoffs directly until the 2015, 2030 period, closer to 2030. There may be some more short-term benefits as LNG is displaced, as I mentioned, to Europe. But where Russia does have a comparative advantage at any one moment in time, like now. They can deliver more gas to Europe faster than these other projects can be built up and scaled. But the problem has a lot to do with the politics in Russia, and that the reluctance to either invite others to invest and to gain ownership of strategic resources, or for other political reasons that Gazprom may want to make short-term profits without investing in the longer term, is cutting away at their window. Because the more they kick the can down the road on Stockman and some of the larger East Siberian fields, that the more time it's going to take to bring them online, and when those things start coming online, they're going to start facing directly the challenges posed by increased LNG and potentially unconventional gas. So their window of opportunity is actually, I would argue, relatively short, and so each one of these problems that they run into, or either political or financial, really cuts into that timeline for them.
Thanks. That was a terrific talk. I learned a ton. And my question is sort of a follow-up on that. It strikes me that you mentioned that the state has this interest in modernization, which, given that the energy industry is very capital-intensive and technologically intensive, creates an interesting set of choices that may split the private sector from the state in Russia. How does this dependence upon Western capital and Western technology, which is obviously means they have to play with the majors and they have to play with Western financial institutions, how does it shape behavior, and is that behavior different? Does it split itself up between the gas and the oil industry, and does it split it up between the private sector and the state? I'm thinking here of a company like Lukoil, which has a market capitalization way below what it should have based on what resources it has, and it recognizes that's because it acts like a Russian company. So it seeks this partnership with ConocoPhillips, tries to be like a Western company, with the hopes it'll be rewarded by much higher capital marketization and much better access to technology. Yet that seems to cut against what's going on in, say, with Gazprom and other parts of the sectors. How does that play itself out, and so what is the future there, and who really holds the upper hand in that relationship?
Between the state and the companies?
Well, both between the state and the companies, and between what everyone recognizes is Russia's going to decline as an energy player unless it plays ball with those people who have the capital and those people who have the technology.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and I think that's in many ways the $100,000 or the $100 big gazillion question for Russia. And I don't have a good answer for that. I mean, I would say that, and remember, I'm looking at how these affect sort of statecraft issues, not sort of. I'm not an expert on energy investments, so I can't. I'm sure there are others in the room that are better at that. But from my vantage point, and looking at the sort of strategic angle, I see this as really being. I mean, this has created opportunities for others, and I sort of alluded to this 2008 renegotiation of the Caspian Pipeline Consortium. There's a state monopoly. The state in the oil sector has a monopoly of the export pipelines, and actually the domestic pipelines. It's called the Transneft State Company, and it controls not only the pipelines, but it controls the allocation of rights to that pipeline by the many private oil companies that are out there. And as part of the state's increasing hubris since 2004, they've tried to use this company. And this company, well, sort of used, they're all sort of part of the same clan, if you will. They have tried to insert themselves in this commercial deal. And what happened was, and this original deal was set up that the state and all private companies, be they foreign or domestic, were treated on the same legal right. There was an international adjudication mechanism where the United States would actually play a front and center role. And there was consensus decision making. So this Transneft in 2008 wanted to wiggle its way into it because this was a rival pipeline not controlled by that state, by the state company. This is an independent pipeline controlled by those investors, state and private. And Transneft tried to insert itself in there. And what the other investors did was they went to Lukoil and they said, look, why don't you join us in this Kazakh downstream investment, or actually it was upstream. It was in the the fields that were going to service the pipeline. And Lukoil said yes, and it split the state interests in this. And then they lobbied the state to the point where, and it became clear that this Transneft had such a weak hand. And so the point, I guess, that I'm trying to make is that there are these fissures here. And I think that in the oil sector, even though there's a restatization and there's a clan overlay onto all this, at base, they're very sensitive to these international pressures because they have longer horizons and they need to look, they want to look like, especially Lukoil, who wants to be a player in other markets. So that's a tool, or that's an element that can be exploited, I guess, by outsiders. In gas, I really do think that both the state and the company see this as a strategic resource. And what was very interesting until very recently, really until Medvedev has started to stand up a little bit on his own, or at least articulate his own thinking, that you used to hear about Gazprom being the developmental model for the Russian state, as it was not only, even Putin, when he would look over the horizon, he would say he doesn't want to be an energy, a basket country. He wants to develop all these cutting-edge technologies, but using the Gazprom model, a very vertically integrated, state-influenced development. Well, they don't talk that much about that anymore. Even Putin doesn't really talk about it that much. Medvedev's vision is very different. In fact, he's now battling the corruption and trying to increase efficiency in the corporate governance sectors. And so how this will play out, I don't know. Medvedev is much weaker, obviously, in these political games. But I think what it shows is that even in the gas sector, we're starting to see that that's not really the model for Russia's future. And so in the strategic realm, I think that we're likely, because they're going to have an increasingly weak hand, they're going to face these market pressures. Because right now, if you think about it, there's depressed domestic demand, there's depressed demand in their established markets, and their emerging markets they're not delivering to the emerging markets. And they're still having trouble satisfying those demands, right? When those demands start going up, Gazprom can't meet them. Even though there may be enough gas, their infrastructure. So I think they're also in a situation where there's going to be some serious market pressure. I think they're going to lose some of the political protection because this isn't the developmental model, I think, that the state sees over the longer term. I mean, we'll see how this plays out in the politics between Putin and Medvedev over time. But, I mean, I do see these fissures there. And like I said, I can't really address head-on what this means for the investment decisions by the firms. But I do see these fissures there, and they create opportunities, I think, on the strategic plane.
So I know there are a couple other questions. I'll get there. I want to interject on this point and ask what I think is a related question about this relationship. So you cited the regulatory power of the Russian state in gas as giving them a lever to perhaps engage in statecraft, in international statecraft, because they can manipulate the domestic gas company, even if it's not state-owned, basically through this lever. And then you told a story, which was that when prices went down in Europe, what the state would do would be to increase domestic gas prices to kind of maintain income for the domestic gas company. And this struck me as almost backwards. It struck me as not, oh, here's a lever that the state is using to influence the domestic company. It struck me as the domestic company has captured the state and is forcing the state to use the regulation for income maintenance for the domestic company. Now, I could imagine the reverse, which is that you could, if you want to divert gas from Europe and you can't order the company to do it, well, what do? Well, you raise domestic prices, and so now the company voluntarily diverts gas from Europe.
Right.
Makes perfect sense, but that doesn't seem to match the story you told, which was not about when the state wants to manipulate the company. It's when the company wants to manipulate the state.
Well, I think it's in conjunction with these other forms of state, the other elements of their strategy, right? Of landing more gas into different markets or dumping. You know, there was a period where they were dumping gas in Europe to drop to to keep others out of it. Right. And there are, so it's not just in and of itself. And it's the state is torn too, right? The state is, has these strategic interests, but they also have the burden, especially over the last 10, 15 years, of not wanting to jack up prices domestically, and have kept them. I mean, I'm talking about relatively modest shifts. I'm not talking about dramatic shifts. And in fact, what it is that they delay increases that they promised they were going to increase, rather than really actually fundamentally raise prices. So it's, I mean, you're right, but I think when you look at the totality of what they're doing with Gazprom and how they're in the diplomacy, in interacting with rival suppliers, is it suggests that it's less that they're captured by the company, and more they have a convergent set of interests during those periods.
I have more of a general question. You sort of mentioned that Russia quite often resorts to coercion in order to conduct its foreign policy, particularly maintain its sphere of influence. It's sort of Secretary Rice's comment about Russia being stuck in 19th century worldview, right? So would you agree that there seems to be an emerging trend of Russia sort of resorting to 21st century tactics and borrowing, in fact, from the United States in order to conduct its foreign policy and maintain its sphere of influence? Recent example would be Kyrgyzstan, where basically Russian support for NGOs, Russian fostering of ties to an opposition, and also Russian media reports sort of some would argue produce such a blowback and favorable to Russia regime change. And you also mentioned Ukraine and IMF, right? It was a different tactic that Russia employed in terms of its gas relations with Ukraine. So would you agree with that trend?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't think Russia, I think I put that statement up there because I think it's misses the boat. I mean, it's too categorical, this notion of Russia's a 19th century sick man of Europe and just, playing these sort of arcane strategic plays. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a whole story about Russia's soft power in Eurasia. The use of language, as you mentioned, the use of media, different minorities. So, yeah, I mean, their relations in the military are such that they have very sophisticated policy. Now, on Kyrgyzstan, I defer to maybe some of you who have been looking at it more specifically. I don't know to what extent they really played that situation. I do think there's a curious irony in the U.S. policy, because here, the last several years, Russia has been actually creating an opening for cooperation in Afghanistan with the transit corridor and after their failed attempt at sort of getting us out of Manas. But we have not. We've kind of they paid lip service to it, but we really wasn't really a big issue for us. But now, with what's going on in Kyrgyzstan, we see, the Russians are, doing this. And, here the Russians have been able to exploit that, because they can be championing the sort of the democratic process, and we're sort of seen, left either without a policy or clutching to the vestiges of what everybody agrees is a pretty corrupt regime. And so I frankly, my understanding of Kyrgyzstan suggests that we're probably not going to see much of the same, much difference. There probably one clan is substituting for another clan, except the difference that we're going to feel in the United States is that our rent on Manas is going to go up. But its strategic situation and how much Russia can really orchestrate that, I do think is somewhat limited.
Hi, I thought your talk was very interesting today, and I just have a question, I guess, piggybacking on Professor Goltz's question, Professor Gavin's question, whether or not the companies are influencing the state, or the state is simply just in control of these companies, again, because when you look at their board of directors, and they're already 60% owned, as you said, they're all not really aligned with Medvedev as much as they are with Putin. So I guess the question is whether you think that Medvedev's talk of modernization is actually going to play a role in modernizing these companies.
I think you're probably, I think the politics on the ground suggests what you said. Once again, what I'm trying to do is trying to explain, because I don't know the answer to that question. I'll be honest with you. I don't know that. I don't think really anybody outside knows the answer to that question. So what interests me is, let's look at what the outcomes are when they play these games, all right? And why is it that they succeed or fail? And it's really interesting because the conventional wisdom is that, well, the state's increasing its hand in the Russian oil sector, so therefore they should have more influence. Okay, yet we really don't see any change in their effectiveness in practicing statecraft. In fact, we see actually the performance of the sector going down, at least in the state, increasingly statized companies. Their performance has gone down. In gas, what was really interesting is in terms of ownership, the state really didn't have a majority stakes until relatively recent, right? Yet we see continuity in their relatively effective statecraft over that. So I don't know that who owns whom is the real big issue here for understanding statecraft. I think it really matters for the development of Russia, which I think you're right to suggest that Medvedev has a much weaker hand than Putin. I think he has a weaker hand across the board for many reasons, not just because of that. So I do see that. But what's interesting though is Putin himself is kind of backing off some of the rhetoric that he was espousing even 2 years ago, when he was really championing Gazprom as the model. He was imposing that on arms exports. He was imposing that on nanotechnology. He sort of identified 5 sectors: the aircraft industry. That's where he saw the Gazprom model being transported. Now they don't really talk about that. Now, is that due to Medvedev or is it due to reality? I can't tell you. Or maybe it's due to the companies saying we're losing money. We're losing markets. We're not getting the technology investment that we need, or we're not getting the joint partnerships that we need by doing this. So even and I go back to the very beginning of the talk where Putin. People forget Putin's current position on energy is he's now inviting investment, but he wants a reciprocal arrangement where you invest in our upstream, but we invest in your downstream. Okay, it's not no investment. Okay, which it was the de facto signal that he was sending before. Now, there may be good reasons for not taking him up on that, but he is shifting a little bit here.